Good morning and welcome back to Next Level Ed Leadership Interview Prep. Have you ever looked at the finalists for a superintendent position and wondered, how did they choose between them? Both of those candidates look excellent. They both have impressive resumes. Both have led successful initiatives. They both interviewed well. From the outside, these two look really similar. How is the board going to choose between these two? Does the board simply choose the person they like better? Or is it the person who's more charismatic or extroverted? Or is it the person that had a slightly better interview? But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if there's something different that the board is looking at when they're comparing two candidates? What if they're asking which candidate creates the least amount of executive risk? School boards are in the risk diminishment business. They don't want to hire a superintendent that's going to cause them problems. So, not surprisingly, they're looking for that new executive leader that they can trust. And as I continued looking at these superintendent interviews, I noticed that the finalists who appeared most similar in the context of the research often communicated very different leadership signals during the interview. And it wasn't because one had more experience or accomplished dramatically more. And it wasn't because one was more charismatic or the other. It's one consistently reduced uncertainty over the course of the interview, while the other unintentionally, my assumption, created that uncertainty. That observation led to our research question of the day. If two superintendent candidates have similar experience, what causes one to feel like a safer executive leadership decision for the school board? Most superintendent candidates prepare for interview questions. School boards are always evaluating something else. I'm Jonathan Royce. Thank you for joining us today. Through Executive Interview Intelligence, each episode explores the leadership signals, decision-making patterns, and executive behaviors that influence superintendent hiring decisions so you can make your executive leadership visible before the board makes its hiring decision. Recognized as one of the top 10 K-12 podcasts on Podomatic, Executive Interview Intelligence is built on the analysis of real superintendent interviews to uncover those hidden executive evaluations taking place throughout the hiring process. We've now analyzed more than 170 superintendent interview questions and candidate responses across multiple superintendent searches. Again and again, the research is pointing to some of the same conclusions. The final hiring decision often isn't about identifying the most qualified candidate. It's about identifying the candidate whose interview creates the least executive uncertainty. This is Executive Interview Intelligence Research Observation number 96. Two superintendent candidates can have similar experience, yet communicate very different levels of executive risk. Let me show you an example here based on a couple of our case studies. In one superintendent search, the board interviewed two highly experienced finalists. Both had served as superintendents and had led districts through significant challenges. Both had earned the opportunity to become finalists, so they made it past round one. When you looked at them, the difference wasn't great. It was really small. But during the interview, the difference in executive risk became much more apparent. Here's the example. One finalist was asked, what does an effective superintendent school board partnership look like in practice, particularly when addressing complex or controversial issues? The candidate one, answered by emphasizing communication, no surprises, weekly meetings with the board chair, building relationships with the board and the community, understanding different perspectives, being available whenever board needs support. And those are all important things that need to happen between the superintendent and the school board. But notice what the board still had to determine even after all those response inputs. How does this superintendent govern through conflict? What happens when board members fundamentally disagree? And how does the superintendent move a difficult issue from disagreement to alignment? The philosophy was clear. The executive operating system required more interpretation that the board had to do. Now compare that with the other finalists. The board asked the exact same question. What does an effective superintendent school board partnership look like in practice, particularly when addressing complex or controversial issues? And this candidate, too, also began by talking about trust. But then the answer shifted, and instead of describing beliefs, the candidate described execution. The board heard about inheriting a fractured board and implementing board development, how the candidate created operating agreements and held structured work sessions and brought in an outside facilitator and established clear expectations for how governance would function on this particular team. Then the candidate shared the outcome of those processes and procedures. For 4 years, the board had not cast a split vote. Now the board didn't have to imagine how the superintendent would govern. They could see evidence of how that leadership had already been demonstrated. So you see the difference between the two candidates there. Both finalists talked about the value of relationships. Both talked about their belief in how much communication between the candidate and the board mattered, but both respected the role of the board. But one interview primarily described leadership beliefs, while the other demonstrated executive execution or leadership in action. That's where executive risk begins to separate finalists. That leadership risk isn't created because a candidate lacks experience. It's created when the board has to infer too much about how that experience translates into the current district's leadership structure. The Superintendent Selection Index reflects that. Both finalists demonstrated strong executive leadership, yet one interview consistently reduced uncertainty faster because governance, decision making, and execution became visible throughout the interview. That's why two candidates with similar resumes can leave a board with very different levels of confidence. The difference isn't in the experience, it's how much executive risk remains after the interview ends. One of the biggest misconceptions about superintendent interviews is that if two finalists have similar experience, the hiring decision comes down to personality or chemistry or simply who interviewed a little bit better. The research suggests something different. School boards aren't simply comparing experience, they're comparing executive risk. They're asking themselves, which candidate gives us the greatest confidence that they can lead this particular district? That confidence isn't created by the resume, it's created by visibility that is provided during the course of the interview and how a candidate's decisions and responses are highlighted during that interview process. When your interview consistently reveals how you make decisions, how you navigate uncertainty, how you govern, and how you execute, the board has fewer questions left unanswered. And the fewer unanswered questions that you give the board, that means less executive risk. That's why two candidates with identical backgrounds or nearly identical in terms of what that looks like on paper can leave the interview with very different leadership profiles. And it's not because one is dramatically more qualified, but because one made their executive leadership easier to see. The strongest superintendent candidates don't spend the interview trying to prove that they're experienced. They spend the interview systematically and intentionally reducing uncertainty one answer at a time, because every answer either increases executive confidence or increases the board's perceived executive risk. Most superintendent candidates prepare for interview questions. School boards are evaluating something else. When you get back to your car or safely pull over, please visit us at analysis.next-level at leadershipinterviewprep.com. The link is in the description. Record an interview and discover whether your decision making is creating executive visibility before the board makes its hiring decision. Because you already know what you're saying. The real question is, what is the board hearing? Until next time, remember, most superintendent candidates prepare for interview questions. School boards are evaluating something else.